The ballroom at Lorimer Hall was full of candlelight and quiet whispers when Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Lorimer, asked Eleanor Winslow to marry him in front of nearly 200 guests. He did not kneel. He did not smile. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at a signature on a contract, and said the words as if they cost him nothing. Eleanor stood very still. Her gloved hands were folded in front of her, and for a moment the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to weep with joy, as any merchant's daughter would weep at the chance to become a duchess. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and studied him, the way one studies a stranger who has said something odd in a foreign language. "Your Grace," she said, her voice clear enough to carry to the edges of the room, "I accept your rejection." A ripple of confused laughter passed through the crowd, quickly swallowed by silence when they realized she was not joking. Julian's brow drew together. He had prepared for many responses to his proposal: gratitude, relief, perhaps even tears. He had not prepared for this. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I did not reject you, I asked for your hand." "You asked for my father's fortune," Eleanor replied, "wrapped in a ring. That is not the same thing as asking for me. So I reject the offer, and in turn, I accept the rejection you have already given me, whether you meant to give it or not." She curtsied, precise and correct, the curtsy of a woman who had been taught manners so thoroughly that even her defiance looked elegant. Then she turned and walked toward the doors leading to the garden, her silk skirts whispering against the marble floor, leaving Julian standing alone in the middle of his own ballroom with an entire audience watching him fail to understand what had just happened. He did not go after her. A duke did not chase. A duke did not need to. But long after the musicians resumed playing and the guests returned to their gossip, Julian remained rooted in place, replaying her words, trying to find the insult in them and finding instead something far more unsettling: the truth. He had not asked for her. He had asked for the solution to a problem, and the problem was money. The Lorimer estate, for all its grandeur, was hollowed out from the inside, like a great tree eaten by rot beneath its bark. Years of poor investments by his late father, a series of failed harvests on the northern lands, and debts inherited rather than created had left Julian with a title that meant everything on paper and almost nothing in his ledgers. His grandmother, the formidable Dowager Duchess Constance, had arranged the match herself, quietly, the way she arranged everything, through private conversations and carefully worded letters, without ever consulting Julian on whether he wished to be married to a woman he barely knew. Eleanor Winslow's father, Edmund Winslow, was a merchant who had built his fortune trading in textiles and shipping, a man of humble beginnings who had clawed his way into rooms where men like him were rarely welcomed. He held a debt owed by the Lorimer estate, a debt large enough to sink what remained of the family's holdings if called in. The Duchess Constance had seen an elegant solution: marry the debt away. Join the Winslow fortune to the Lorimer name, and the debt would simply dissolve into a marriage settlement, as though it had never existed. Julian had gone along with it because it was easier to go along with it than to fight his grandmother, and because, if he was honest with himself, he had stopped believing that marriage needed to be anything more than an arrangement between two people who understood their roles. He had watched enough marriages built on affection crumble under the weight of debt and duty. Better, he had thought, to build a marriage on practical foundations from the start. He had not expected the foundation to speak back. Outside in the garden, Eleanor walked quickly along the gravel path until the sound of the orchestra faded behind her, replaced by the quiet chirp of crickets and the soft rustle of wind through the hedges. She stopped beside a stone fountain and pressed her hand to her chest, willing her heartbeat to slow. She had not planned to say those words. She had planned, if she was honest, to simply decline politely, to offer some gentle excuse about needing time to consider such an important decision. But something about the flatness in his eyes when he proposed, the way he had looked at her like a ledger entry waiting to be finalized, had unlocked something in her that she usually kept firmly closed. She had been that ledger entry before. 3 years ago, a man named Charles Bennet had convinced her, and everyone who knew her, that he loved her beyond reason. He had written her letters full of poetry. He had walked with her through this very kind of garden, speaking of a future together with such conviction that she had believed every word. Then an heiress with a larger dowry appeared on the horizon, and Charles had ended their engagement with a letter so brief it could have been mistaken for a note about the weather. She had promised herself, standing in her father's parlor with that letter in her hands, that she would never again be a convenient answer to someone else's arithmetic. She would rather be alone, entirely and completely alone, than be chosen for what she brought instead of who she was. And so when the Duke of Lorimer, a man she had spoken to perhaps 4 times in her life, asked for her hand with the warmth of a man requesting a receipt, something old and protective had risen up in her chest and spoken before her careful manners could stop it. She did not regret the words. She only wondered, standing alone by the fountain with the cool night air settling around her shoulders, what would happen now that she had said them in front of the entire county. Behind her, footsteps crunched on the gravel. She turned, expecting perhaps her father or her friend Margaret, who had accompanied her to the ball and would surely have heard by now what had happened inside. Instead, it was the Duke himself. He had removed his formal gloves, and in the moonlight, without the crowd around him, he looked less like a portrait of nobility and more like a tired young man carrying a weight far too heavy for his shoulders. Lorimer straightened her spine and prepared herself for anger, for the sharp words of a man humiliated in front of his peers. "You embarrassed me," he said instead quietly without heat, "in my own home." "I told the truth," Lorimer answered. "If the truth embarrassed you, perhaps it was the truth that needed changing, not my willingness to speak it." Julian studied her for a long moment. The moonlight caught the edge of her jaw, the steady set of her shoulders, the way she did not look away from him even though every rule of society demanded she should. He had expected, when he followed her out here, to demand an apology. Instead, he found himself asking a different question entirely. "Do you truly believe I see you as nothing more than a solution to a debt? Do you believe otherwise, Your Grace?" He opened his mouth to answer and found, to his own surprise, that he had no ready reply. He thought of the conversations with his grandmother, the careful calculations of dowries and settlements, the way Lorimer's name had first entered his awareness attached to a number rather than a face. He thought of how little he actually knew about the woman standing in front of him, other than the size of her father's fortune, and the fact that she read novels, a detail he recalled only because his grandmother had mentioned it with faint disapproval. "I asked for your hand because it seemed a reasonable arrangement," he admitted finally, choosing honesty over practiced charm, perhaps because he sensed that charm would fail entirely against a woman who had already seen through him once tonight. "I will not pretend otherwise, but I did not intend cruelty." "Intention rarely matters to the person left standing in the wreckage of it," Lorimer said. "I do not say this to wound you further, Your Grace. I say it because I think you have never had to consider what it feels like to be valued for something other than yourself. I have, and I will not marry into that feeling again." Again. The word hung between them, small but heavy, and Julian, who prided himself on reading people quickly, understood that there was a story behind it, a story he was not yet permitted to hear. "Then I will not ask again tonight," he said. "But I would ask permission to understand you better, Miss Winslow, before you decide the matter is entirely closed." Lorimer considered him. There was something almost boyish in the request, a flicker of curiosity beneath the ducal composure that she had not expected to find. "You may understand me as any acquaintance understands another," she said carefully. "That is all I offer tonight." It was not agreement, but it was not refusal either, and Julian found himself strangely satisfied with the compromise, more satisfied than he had felt at any point during the evening's carefully orchestrated proposal. He bowed properly, the way he had been taught since childhood, and let her walk back toward the lights of the ballroom alone, understanding without being told that she needed the space to reclaim her composure before facing the whispers that surely awaited her inside. He remained by the fountain a while longer, turning her words over in his mind. "I accept your rejection." It should have offended him. Instead, it lodged itself somewhere deep and uncomfortable, a splinter he could not quite work loose, and he suspected, with a growing sense of unease, that this would not be the last time Lorimer Winslow surprised him. Inside, the ball continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened, though the whispers told a different story. Guests leaned toward one another behind painted fans, exchanging the details of what they had witnessed, embellishing here and there as gossip always does. By morning, all of the county would know that the merchant's daughter had refused the Duke of Lorimer in front of everyone, and that the Duke, rather than storming away in offended pride, had followed her into the garden like a man chasing something he did not yet understand he wanted. Lorimer's father found her near the refreshment table some time later, his broad face creased with worry beneath his carefully styled wig. "Lorimer," he said quietly, drawing her aside. "What happened? I heard talk of a proposal and of a refusal, though the details seemed to shift with every teller." "The Duke asked for my hand," she said simply. "I declined." Edmund Winslow's face paled slightly. He had spent 30 years building a name for himself in a world that had never wanted him in it, a world of old titles and older prejudices, and he understood better than most how quickly a family's fortunes could turn on a single decision, a single alliance made or broken. "Lorimer," he said carefully, "you understand what is at stake. The debt owed to me by the Lorimer estate is considerable. If it is not settled through some arrangement, I may be forced to call it in, and that would ruin them." "Then let it ruin them," Lorimer said, though her voice wavered slightly, betraying the difficulty of the words. "I will not be traded for a debt, father, not even to save a duke from his own family's mistakes." Her father studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, the worry giving way to something gentler, something that looked almost like pride, though tinged with concern. "You remind me of your mother," he said quietly. "She refused 3 offers before she accepted mine, and every one of them wealthier men than I was at the time. I always wondered what made her choose me in the end." "What did she say when you asked her?" "She said she chose me because I was the only one who asked what she wanted, rather than what she was worth." He smiled faintly at the memory, though sadness lingered at its edges, for Lorimer's mother had passed when Lorimer was still a girl, leaving behind only stories and a daughter who had inherited her stubborn heart. "Perhaps, in time, someone will ask you the same question and mean it." Lorimer did not answer, but she thought, unbidden, of the Duke standing by the fountain, asking permission to understand her rather than demanding her hand outright. She pushed the thought away quickly, unwilling to examine it too closely on a night when her emotions were already raw from the evening's events. Across the room, Julian had returned from the garden, and though he wore his composed expression once more, several of his peers noticed a distracted quality to his replies, as though part of his attention remained elsewhere, turning over a puzzle he could not solve. His closest friend, Lord Henry Ashford, found him near the terrace doors and clapped a hand on his shoulder with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. "Well," Henry said, grinning, "that was certainly not the evening anyone expected, refused in front of the whole county. I imagine your grandmother is somewhere breathing fire." "She is likely already composing 3 letters of apology and 1 letter of strategy," Julian said dryly. "She does not take surprises well." "And you, how do you take them?" Julian was quiet for a moment, watching across the room as Lorimer spoke with her father, her chin lifted, her posture unbowed despite what must have been a mortifying evening for her as well. "I find," he said slowly, "that I am more curious than offended, which troubles me more than the refusal itself." Henry raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by this admission from a man not known for expressing curiosity about much beyond estate matters and hunting. "Curious how?" "She spoke to me as though I were an ordinary man who had made a poor choice, rather than a duke whose choices are simply accepted without question. No one has spoken to me that way since my father died." "Perhaps that is exactly why she refused you," Henry said thoughtfully. "Perhaps she wanted to see if you would notice the difference." Julian did not answer, but the words settled into him alongside Lorimer's own, forming the beginning of a question he could not yet fully articulate. a question about what it might mean to be seen not as a title or a solution to a debt, but simply as himself. The evening wound down eventually, as evenings do, the candles burning low, the musicians packing away their instruments, the guests departing into the cool night in a procession of carriages. Elinor left with her father, the two of them quiet in the swaying darkness of their carriage, each lost in their own thoughts about what the night had set into motion. Julian remained at the doorway of Lorimer Hall long after the last guest had gone, watching the empty drive where torches still burned in their sconces, casting long shadows across the gravel. His grandmother would want to speak with him in the morning, no doubt with considerable displeasure. The debt still loomed, unresolved, a weight pressing down on the estate and everyone who depended on it. And yet, standing there in the quiet aftermath of a proposal gone spectacularly wrong, Julian found himself thinking not of ledgers or debts, but of a woman with steady eyes and an unbending spine, who had looked at him and seen exactly what he was, and had the courage to say so aloud. He did not know it yet, standing there in the torchlight, but the words she had spoken to him that night, meant as a rejection, would become the first true thing anyone had said to him in years. And though neither of them could have guessed it then, that single sentence, spoken with such quiet conviction in front of 200 witnesses, was not an ending at all. It was only the beginning. Word of the evening's events traveled faster than any letter could have carried it. By the following afternoon, 3 separate versions of the story had already reached the drawing rooms of the county's finest houses, each more dramatic than the last. In one telling, Elinor had wept and fled the ballroom in despair. In another, she had laughed in the Duke's face before storming out entirely. The truth, as it so often is, was far quieter and far more interesting than any of the rumors, though few seemed inclined to seek it out when embellishment served gossip so much better. Margaret Cole, Elinor's closest friend since childhood, arrived at the Winslow townhouse before noon, her bonnet slightly askew from the haste of her journey, clutching a fan she had forgotten to open even once during the entire carriage ride. "Elinor Winslow," she declared upon being shown into the parlor, "you are either the bravest woman in England or the most foolish, and I confess I have not yet decided which." Elinor, seated by the window with an unread book in her lap, looked up with a tired smile. "Perhaps I am both, Margaret. The two are not always so different as people like to believe." Margaret settled onto the chair across from her, finally snapping her fan open with a decisive flick of her wrist. "Tell me everything, and do not leave out a single detail, for I have already heard 4 different accounts this morning alone, and I trust none of them." So Elinor told her, quietly and honestly, everything from the flat coldness of the proposal to the strange, unexpected conversation by the fountain afterward. Margaret listened with wide eyes, her fan forgotten once more in her lap. "He followed you into the garden," she said slowly, as though testing the words for their truth. "A duke, humiliated in front of the entire county, followed the woman who humiliated him, not to demand an apology, but to ask to understand her better." "It does sound rather absurd when you say it aloud," Elinor admitted. "It sounds," Margaret said, leaning forward with the particular intensity she reserved for matters of romance, "like the beginning of something neither of you expected. Men do not chase after wounded pride unless something else is stirring beneath it. Do not romanticize this, Margaret. He wanted my father's fortune. That has not changed simply because he followed me outside to ask a few questions." "Perhaps," Margaret conceded, "or perhaps a man cannot help what stirs in him, even when his intentions began elsewhere entirely." She smiled knowingly. "Either way, my dear, I do not think you have heard the last of the Duke of Lorimer." Elinor said nothing, though privately she suspected her friend was right, and the thought filled her with a complicated tangle of feelings she was not yet ready to examine too closely. She turned instead to look out the window, where the ordinary bustle of the street continued exactly as it had the day before, as though the previous evening's drama had changed nothing at all in the wider world, even as it had quietly begun to change everything in her own small corner of it. The Dowager Duchess Constance Ashcombe was not a woman who tolerated surprises, and the events of the previous evening had delivered one so large that she summoned Julian to her private sitting room before he had even finished his morning coffee. She sat rigidly upright in her favorite chair by the fire, her silver hair pinned with the same precision she applied to everything else in her life, and regarded her grandson with an expression that could have frozen a summer garden. "Explain to me," she said without preamble, "how a proposal I arranged with such careful attention to every detail became the subject of ridicule across 3 counties before breakfast." "I proposed. She declined. There is little more to explain," Julian said, settling into the chair across from her with more composure than he felt. "There is a great deal more to explain, Julian, and you know it. A young woman does not simply decline a duke in front of 200 witnesses without cause, and you did not simply accept that decline without following her into the garden like a lovesick poet." Her sharp eyes narrowed. "What passed between you out there?" Julian hesitated, unwilling to share the particulars of a conversation that felt, in retrospect, far too private to hand over to his grandmother's calculating mind. "We spoke. She made her position clear. I respect it." "Respect it?" The Duchess's voice rose slightly, a rare break in her usual composure. "Julian, do you understand what is at stake? Edmund Winslow holds enough of our debt to see this family stripped of everything but the title itself. A title with no land, no house, no income is nothing but a decoration on a name, worn by a man with no means to support it. This marriage was never merely a matter of preference. It was a matter of survival." "I am aware of the stakes, grandmother." "I have been aware of little else for the past 2 years." Julian's voice hardened slightly, an edge of frustration creeping through his usual restraint. "But I will not force a woman into a marriage she does not want simply because our family's ledgers demand it." "No one is speaking of force. I am speaking of persuasion, of courtship, of the ordinary arts that have secured advantageous matches for centuries. You proposed to her as though reading from a legal document, Julian. Is it any wonder she refused?" The observation struck closer to the truth than Julian wished to admit, and he said nothing for a long moment, staring instead into the fire crackling in the hearth. "You will call on her," the Duchess continued, her tone shifting into the brisk efficiency she used when planning any campaign, whether social or otherwise. "Not to propose again, not yet. Simply to demonstrate that you are a man capable of genuine interest, rather than a calculating machine seeking to balance a ledger. Women are not moved by numbers, Julian. They are moved by attention." "You speak as though you are an expert in matters of the heart," Julian said, a faint, wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth despite himself. "I recall you telling me once that you married my grandfather for his estate and grew fond of him only afterward, out of necessity rather than affection." The Duchess's expression flickered, something old and complicated passing briefly across her features before her composure reasserted itself. "There are many kinds of love, Julian, and not all of them announce themselves at first meeting. Some grow slowly, from respect, from shared purpose, from simply choosing, day after day, to build something together. That is no less real for having begun in practicality." She waved a hand, dismissing the sentimental turn of the conversation as though embarrassed by it. "Regardless, you will call on Miss Winslow. You will bring flowers, though nothing so extravagant as to appear desperate. You will speak with her about matters that have nothing to do with debts or settlements. And you will, for once in your carefully controlled life, allow yourself to be curious about another person rather than simply cataloging their usefulness." Julian left his grandmother's sitting room with more to consider than he had entered with, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that the prospect of calling on Lorimer Winslow did not fill him with the dread he might have expected only a day before. Instead, there was something almost like anticipation stirring beneath his usual composure, a feeling so unfamiliar that he did not immediately recognize it for what it was. Meanwhile, in the offices of Winslow Trading Company, Edmund Winslow sat across from his solicitor, a thin, careful man named Mr. Pratt, discussing the very debt that hung over both families like a storm cloud refusing to break. "The Lorimer estate owes a considerable sum, sir," Mr. Pratt said, adjusting his spectacles as he consulted the ledger before him. "If called in immediately, It would likely force the sale of at least 2 of their remaining properties, perhaps more, depending on current market conditions for agricultural land in that region. I have no wish to see the Duke ruined, Pratt. I have never wished that. Edmund rubbed a hand across his weathered face, the face of a man who had spent decades earning respect through labor rather than birth, and who understood, perhaps better than most, what it meant to lose everything and have to rebuild from nothing. I extended that loan because the previous Duke was a fair man in his dealings with me, back when few men of his station would even speak to a merchant as an equal. I do not wish to punish the son for circumstances that grew beyond his control. Then you intend to extend the terms further, sir? I intend, Edmund said slowly, to let my daughter make her own choices, whatever they may be, and to support her in them regardless of what becomes of the debt. If the marriage does not happen, we will find another arrangement for the Lorimer estate to settle its obligations over time. I will not have Lorimer believe, for even a single moment, that her happiness is a currency to be spent on my behalf. Mr. Pratt nodded, though a flicker of concern crossed his careful features. That is generous of you, sir, though I would be remiss not to mention that the company's own finances have grown somewhat strained of late, with the losses from the shipping venture in the spring. The debt, if collected, would provide considerable relief. Edmund was quiet for a moment, the weight of that truth settling heavily upon him. He had not told Lorimer about the shipping losses, not wanting to burden her with worries that were, in the end, his own to carry. But the reality remained. The debt owed by the Lorimer estate was not merely an abstract sum in a ledger. It represented security for his own business, for the livelihoods of the men and women who depended on Winslow Trading Company for their wages, for the future he hoped to build and eventually pass down. I understand the difficulty, Pratt, he said finally. But I will not trade my daughter's future for my own convenience. We will find another way. That afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent toward the rooftops of the city, a carriage bearing the Lorimer crest arrived outside the Winslow townhouse. Lorimer, who had been reading in the parlor with little success at actually absorbing any of the words on the page, looked up in surprise when the housekeeper announced the Duke's arrival. "He is here," she asked, setting the book aside with more haste than she intended to reveal. "Waiting in the front hall, miss, with the most enormous bouquet of flowers I have seen this side of a wedding," the housekeeper reported, her expression carefully neutral though her eyes betrayed considerable curiosity. Lorimer took a moment to compose herself, smoothing her skirts and checking her reflection in the small mirror above the mantel, before making her way to the front hall with as much dignity as she could summon. Julian stood waiting, indeed holding a bouquet, though a more modest one than the housekeeper's description had suggested, a simple arrangement of white roses and lavender that spoke more of thoughtfulness than extravagance. He bowed properly upon seeing her, and Lorimer noted, with some surprise, a faint flush of nervousness in his expression that had been entirely absent during the flat, businesslike proposal of the previous evening. "Your Grace," she said, offering a measured curtsy, "this is unexpected." "I hoped it might be," Julian admitted. "I find I owe you an apology, Miss Winslow, though I confess I am somewhat out of practice at delivering them sincerely." Lorimer raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite her better judgment. "Then perhaps you should simply attempt honesty instead. I find it tends to serve better than practiced words." "Very well." He extended the flowers toward her, and she accepted them with careful hands, the scent of lavender rising softly between them. "I apologize for treating our marriage as a transaction rather than a possibility between two people who might, in time, come to know and value one another. I was wrong to assume that duty alone would be sufficient reason for you to accept, and wrong to overlook that you are a person with feelings and expectations of your own, rather than simply a solution to circumstances beyond your making." The words were careful, clearly considered, and Lorimer found herself searching his expression for the calculation she had seen the night before, the flat practicality that had colored his original proposal. She found, instead, something that looked remarkably like genuine effort, the awkward sincerity of a man unaccustomed to admitting fault. "I accept your apology, Your Grace," she said finally. "Though I hope you understand that an apology, however sincere, does not undo what was said, nor does it obligate me to reconsider my answer." "I understand entirely," Julian said. "I ask for nothing beyond the opportunity to know you properly, as I should have sought to know you before ever proposing marriage. Whatever comes of that acquaintance or does not come of it will be decided honestly, rather than through arrangement alone." Elinor considered him for a long moment, the flowers still cradled in her arms, their sweet fragrance mingling with the late afternoon light filtering through the hall's tall windows. Something in her, the same something that had spoken so boldly the night before, whispered caution, reminding her of Charles Bennet's poetry and promises, of how convincingly a man could perform sincerity when it served his purposes. But something else in her, quieter and more curious, wondered if perhaps this was different, if perhaps a man who admitted his failures so plainly, without excuse or deflection, might be worth the risk of finding out. "Would you care to walk in the garden, Your Grace?" she asked finally. "It seems we have already established that gardens suit our conversations rather better than ballrooms." A genuine smile broke across Julian's face, transforming his usually composed features into something younger, more open, more human. "I would like that very much, Miss Winslow." They walked together through the modest but carefully tended garden behind the Winslow townhouse, speaking of ordinary things at first: the weather, the state of the roads leading into the city, the recent renovations to a nearby church. Slowly, gradually, the conversation deepened, and Elinor found herself telling him about her love of novels, about the small library she had assembled over years of careful collecting, about her mother, who had died when Elinor was 12, leaving behind only stories and a stubborn insistence that a woman's worth was never measured by her dowry. Julian, in turn, spoke haltingly at first, then with growing openness, about his father's death 3 years prior, about inheriting a title weighted down with debts he had not created, but was nonetheless responsible for resolving, about the loneliness of a position that demanded constant performance and offered little genuine companionship in return. "I did not expect to enjoy this," Elinor admitted as the light began to fade toward evening, casting long shadows across the garden path. "Nor did I," Julian said. "Though I confess, Miss Winslow, I find myself rather glad to have been wrong." They stood for a moment in comfortable silence, the last of the daylight painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and Elinor thought, with a flicker of surprise, that perhaps Margaret had been right after all. Perhaps this was not the end of the story that had begun so dramatically the night before. Perhaps, instead, it was only the beginning of something neither of them had expected, something that would require far more courage from both of them than either yet understood, but something that felt, in this quiet garden moment, undeniably real. As Julian's carriage pulled away from the Winslow townhouse that evening, he found himself smiling for reasons he could not entirely explain. A small, private smile that lingered long after the townhouse had faded from view behind him. He had come intending only to apologize, to fulfill his grandmother's instructions, and perhaps salvage what remained of his reputation after the previous evening's public humiliation. He had not expected to leave wanting, quite desperately, to see Elinor Winslow again. 3 weeks passed, and in that time, a quiet rhythm developed between the Winslow townhouse and Lorimer Hall, one built not on grand romantic gestures but on small, persistent kindnesses that gradually wore away at Elinor's carefully constructed defenses. Julian called twice each week, always with some small offering, a book he thought she might enjoy, a sprig of herbs from the Lorimer gardens, once even a small sketch he had attempted himself of the fountain where they had first spoken honestly, though he insisted with genuine embarrassment that his artistic talents were considerably inferior to his other pursuits. Elinor found herself, despite every instinct toward caution, beginning to look forward to these visits with an eagerness she tried, not entirely successfully, to hide from herself. There was something in Julian's company that felt different from anything she had experienced with Charles Bennet all those years ago. Charles had been effusive, extravagant with his words, quick to promise devotion in flowery declarations that, in hindsight, had rung hollow the moment they were tested by better prospects. Julian was quieter, more careful, and somehow that carefulness felt more trustworthy than any of Charles's poetry ever had. Still, she guarded her heart closely, aware that a man's true character often revealed itself not in pleasant garden conversations, but in moments of genuine difficulty, moments that tested whether his professed regard could withstand real pressure. That test arrived sooner than either of them expected, in the form of a formal invitation to a house party at Lorimer Hall, arranged ostensibly to celebrate the upcoming harvest season, but understood by everyone involved as an opportunity for the county's finest families to observe the developing situation between the Duke and the merchant's daughter, and to form their own judgments about whether the match, however unconventional its beginning, might yet come to fruition. Aliner's father encouraged her to attend, seeing it as an opportunity to demonstrate that the Winslow family belonged in such circles regardless of how the courtship ultimately resolved itself. Margaret, predictably, was beside herself with excitement, already planning which gowns Aliner should wear for each of the fortnight's anticipated events. "You must wear the blue silk for the first evening," Margaret insisted, pacing back and forth across Aliner's bedroom with the particular energy she reserved for matters of fashion and romance combined. "It brings out your eyes beautifully, and you will want to make a strong impression, especially given how many eyes will be watching for any sign of weakness." "I am not attending to make impressions, Margaret. I am attending because my father wished it, and because I have agreed to allow the Duke the opportunity to know me better." Aliner examined her reflection in the mirror with a critical eye, smoothing an errant strand of hair back into place. "Though I confess, the thought of 2 weeks under the scrutiny of the entire county does fill me with some trepidation." "You need not fear scrutiny, Aliner. You have already survived the most difficult scrutiny imaginable, refusing a duke in front of everyone and somehow emerging with your reputation intact, even enhanced in certain circles who admire your courage. Whatever awaits at Lorimer Hall, I do not believe it will trouble you half so much as you expect." Aliner was not entirely convinced, but she packed her trunks with careful attention nonetheless, and within a few days found herself arriving at Lorimer Hall alongside a dozen other guests, all drawn from the county's most prominent families, each carrying their own opinions about the peculiar courtship unfolding before them. The estate itself was grander than Aliner had appreciated during the brief glimpse she had caught of it during the ball weeks earlier. Rolling green lawns stretched toward distant woodlands, and the main house rose in elegant stone against the autumn sky, its many windows catching the afternoon light. Yet beneath the grandeur, Aliner noticed small signs of the financial strain Julian had mentioned during their garden conversations: faded curtains in certain rooms, furniture that had clearly been repaired rather than replaced, a general sense of careful maintenance rather than lavish renewal. The Dowager Duchess Constance received the guests personally, her sharp eyes lingering on Aliner with an assessing quality that made clear the older woman had not yet decided whether to approve of her grandson's unconventional courtship. "Miss Winslow," the Duchess said, extending a hand with cool formality, "I trust your journey was comfortable." "Quite comfortable, thank you, Your Grace. Your estate is very beautiful." "It has been in the family for many generations," the Duchess replied, her tone carrying the particular pride of someone deeply invested in legacy and continuity. "I hope, whatever the outcome of the coming weeks, that its beauty is properly appreciated by whoever ultimately shares in its keeping." The comment was pointed enough that Aliner understood its true meaning immediately, and she met the Duchess's gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated by the implicit challenge. "Beauty, Your Grace, means little without genuine regard between the people who share a home. I would hope any future keeper of Lorimer Hall understands that as well as you clearly do." Something flickered in the Duchess's expression, surprise perhaps or grudging respect, though her composed features gave little else away. "We shall see, Miss Winslow, we shall see." The days that followed fell into a pleasant, if carefully observed, Routine. Mornings brought walks through the extensive gardens and surrounding countryside. Afternoons featured various entertainments, archery for those inclined toward sport, quiet reading rooms for those who preferred more sedate pursuits, and evenings gathered everyone together for dinner and conversation, followed often by music or cards. Julian made a point of seeking Alina out during each day's activities, though never so obviously as to draw undue attention from the watching guests. Instead, their growing acquaintance unfolded through small moments: a shared glance during a particularly amusing conversation at dinner, a quiet word exchanged while others were occupied elsewhere, a walk taken together along the estate's wooded paths under the pretense of admiring the autumn colors. It was during one such walk, several days into the house party, that an incident occurred which would reveal far more about Julian's character than any number of pleasant conversations could have accomplished. They had wandered somewhat further than intended, following a narrow path along the edge of a small ravine that cut through the eastern portion of the estate. Julian, walking slightly ahead to hold back a low-hanging branch for Alina's passage, misjudged his footing on the uneven ground and stumbled, his ankle twisting sharply beneath him as he fell against a jagged outcropping of stone. "Julian!" Alina rushed forward, all formality forgotten in the sudden alarm of the moment, kneeling beside him as he gripped his ankle with a sharp intake of breath. "I am well," he said through gritted teeth, though his pale expression suggested otherwise. "Merely clumsy. Please do not trouble yourself." "You are bleeding," Alina observed, noting the torn fabric of his sleeve where it had caught against the same outcropping, revealing a shallow but freely bleeding scrape along his forearm. "And your ankle does not look at all well, Your Grace. This is no time for false stoicism." Without waiting for his agreement, she tore a strip of fabric from her own petticoat, ignoring his protests that such measures were entirely unnecessary, and that she should not ruin her clothing on his account, and began binding the wound with the same practical efficiency she might have applied to any household task, her fingers steady despite the urgency of the moment. "You need not do this yourself," Julian said, watching her work with an expression caught between embarrassment and something warmer, something he did not yet have words for. "There are servants at the house who could attend to this." "The house is nearly a mile away, Your Grace, and you are bleeding now. Practicality demands immediate attention, not delayed propriety." She finished securing the makeshift bandage and looked up to meet his eyes, finding him watching her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something almost like wonder. "What is it?" "Nothing," he said, then reconsidered, some instinct urging him toward honesty rather than deflection. "I am simply struck by how little regard you show for what a duchess is supposed to do, and how much regard you show for what actually needs doing. It is rather refreshing." "I was raised by a merchant, Your Grace, not a duchess. We tend to value usefulness over ornamentation." She helped him to his feet, allowing him to lean on her shoulder for support as he tested his weight cautiously on the injured ankle. "Can you walk, do you think, or shall I go for assistance?" "I believe I can manage with your assistance." He offered a rueful smile, wincing slightly as he took his first careful step. "Though I confess, I would rather endure the walk with your help than wait alone for someone else to arrive." They made their way slowly back toward the house, Julian leaning on Alina more than his pride wished to admit, their pace unhurried despite the growing chill of the late afternoon air. Conversation flowed more easily between them during this slow, difficult walk than it had during any of their previous, more formal exchanges, as though the small crisis had stripped away some final layer of careful performance, revealing something more genuine underneath. "I have been thinking," Julian said, his breath slightly labored from the exertion, "about what you said the night I first proposed. About being valued for what you bring rather than who you are." "I remember it well," Alina said. "I have thought of little else these past weeks, if I am entirely honest. I wonder if perhaps I misunderstood, initially, what such a wound might feel like. I have never had reason to question whether people valued me for myself or for my title, because the two have always been intertwined in ways I could not easily separate. But watching you these past weeks, seeing how carefully you observe everyone's intentions, how slowly you allow anyone close enough to matter. I begin to understand what it must have cost you to be treated as a solution to a problem rather than a person worth knowing." Lorimer was quiet for a moment, surprised by the depth of reflection in his words, so different from the careless proposal that had begun their acquaintance weeks earlier. "It cost a great deal, Your Grace. More than I care to discuss in detail, though perhaps someday I will trust you enough to share the whole of it. I would welcome that trust whenever you feel ready to offer it. And I would ask nothing in return except the honesty you have always given me, even when that honesty proved inconvenient for my pride." They reached the house as the last light of afternoon began to fade, and the sight of them arriving together, Julian visibly injured and leaning on Lorimer's support, sparked considerable alarm and curiosity among the assembled guests. The Dowager Duchess herself appeared in the front hall, her composed expression cracking briefly with genuine concern as she surveyed her grandson's condition. "What has happened here?" she demanded, already summoning servants to fetch bandages and warm water. "A minor accident on the eastern path, nothing more," Julian assured her, though he winced as he attempted to demonstrate his ability to stand independently. Miss Winslow was kind enough to provide immediate assistance. The Duchess's sharp eyes moved from her grandson's face to Lorimer's, taking in the torn petticoat, the practical efficiency of the bandage still wrapped around Julian's forearm, and something in her expression shifted, a grudging reassessment visible even beneath her carefully maintained composure. "It seems, Miss Winslow, that you are rather more useful in a crisis than most of the young ladies of my acquaintance," she observed, her tone carrying, for the first time, something that might have been approval rather than mere assessment. "I was simply raised to be practical, Your Grace." It seemed the sensible response to the circumstances. "Indeed." The Duchess considered her for another long moment before turning her attention back to organizing her grandson's care, but Lorimer noted, with some surprise, that the older woman's tone toward her remained noticeably warmer for the remainder of the evening, as though the incident had earned her a measure of respect that weeks of careful conversation had not yet achieved. That evening, once Julian's ankle had been properly attended to by the estate's physician, and pronounced merely sprained rather than broken, Lorimer found a few private moments to speak with Margaret, who had watched the day's events unfold with undisguised fascination. "You carried a duke, quite literally, back to his own house," Margaret said, her eyes bright with amusement and something more serious beneath it. "I do not think I have ever heard of such a thing happening at any house party in the county's history." "I did not carry him, Margaret, merely provided some support. He is entirely capable of walking, even with an injured ankle." Lorimer could not quite suppress her own smile, however, remembering the quiet vulnerability in Julian's expression as she had bound his wound, so different from the cold composure of their first encounter. "Though I confess, the entire experience did reveal something about his character I had not fully appreciated before." "And what is that?" "That he does not require performance from me, Margaret." He seemed genuinely grateful for practical assistance, rather than expecting me to swoon or panic, as some men might expect of a lady in such circumstances. He treated my capability as something to be valued, rather than something unbecoming of a future duchess. Margaret's expression softened, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You are beginning to trust him, aren't you? Truly trust him, not merely tolerate his company for propriety's sake." Lorimer did not answer immediately, staring instead out the window of her guest chamber toward the darkened gardens below, where she could still faintly recall the quiet conversation she and Julian had shared during their slow walk back to the house. "I am beginning to consider the possibility," she said finally, choosing her words with care. "Though I remain cautious, Margaret. Trust, once broken, does not rebuild itself easily, and I have been wrong about a man's character before, to my own considerable cost. I understand your caution, truly I do. But I have known you your entire life, Lorimer, and I have never seen you look at anyone the way you looked at him when you returned from that walk today. Whatever guard you have built around your heart these past 3 years, I think it is beginning, ever so slowly, to come down." Lorimer did not deny it, though she said nothing further on the matter, allowing the quiet truth of Margaret's observation to settle over her as she prepared for sleep that night. Outside her window, the autumn stars wheeled slowly overhead, indifferent to the small, significant shifts occurring in the hearts of two people who had begun their acquaintance under the worst possible circumstances, and who now found themselves, against every expectation, growing genuinely fond of one another. In his own chambers down the hall, his injured ankle propped carefully on a cushion, Julian lay awake far longer than his body's exhaustion warranted, replaying the day's events in his mind. He thought of Lorimer's steady hands binding his wound, of her sharp, practical mind cutting through unnecessary drama to address what actually needed doing, of the quiet strength she carried so unassumingly beneath her carefully maintained composure. He had proposed to her weeks ago as a solution to a problem, viewing marriage as a practical arrangement between two people who would learn, in time, to coexist comfortably enough. He understood now, lying in the darkness with his ankle throbbing dully, and his heart doing something considerably more complicated, that he no longer wanted merely comfortable coexistence. He realized with something between alarm and quiet joy, to know Lorimer Winslow entirely, to earn not merely her tolerance but her genuine affection, freely given rather than practically arranged. The realization settled over him like a weight he had not expected to carry, and yet, strangely, it did not feel burdensome at all. It felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like the beginning of something worth pursuing for its own sake, entirely separate from debts, from duty, from anything but the simple, undeniable fact that Lorimer Winslow had become, somehow, essential to his happiness in a way no ledger entry or family obligation ever could. The remaining days of the house party unfolded with a gentler rhythm than the eventful afternoon of Julian's injury, though the incident had shifted something fundamental in how the other guests regarded the developing courtship between the Duke and Lorimer. Where once there had been curious whispers and speculative glances, now there was a quieter sort of attention, as though everyone present understood they were witnessing something more genuine than the calculated arrangements typical of such gatherings. Julian's ankle healed steadily under the physician's care, though he was advised to rest it as much as possible, a directive he found himself unexpectedly grateful for, as it provided a convenient excuse to remain in quieter corners of the house rather than participating in the more strenuous activities planned for the other guests. Lorimer, sensing perhaps that he would appreciate company during his enforced convalescence, began spending her afternoons in the estate's smaller library, ostensibly to read, but in truth to sit near him, as he worked through correspondence and estate matters with his steward. "You need not keep me company out of pity, Miss Winslow," Julian said one afternoon, looking up from a particularly tedious letter regarding tenant rents to find Lorimer settled comfortably in the chair across from his desk, a book open in her lap, though her attention seemed more focused on him than on its pages. "I assure you, Your Grace, pity has nothing to do with it. I find your library considerably more interesting than the archery lawn, and considerably quieter than the drawing-room, where Lady Fairweather has been discussing her nephew's prospects for the better part of 2 hours without pause for breath." Julian laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that seemed to surprise even himself. Lady Fairweather's nephew has been engaged to be married for the better part of a year, if I recall correctly. I cannot imagine what prospects remain for discussion. Nor can I, and yet somehow she has found an entire afternoon's worth of material on the subject. Lorimer smiled, closing her book entirely now, abandoning the pretense of reading. "May I ask what troubles you so thoroughly in that letter? You have read it 3 times now, and your expression grows more pained with each reading." Julian set the letter aside with a sigh, rubbing a hand across his tired eyes. "It is nothing so dramatic, merely the ordinary difficulty of an estate stretched thin. One of our tenant farmers, a good man with a large family, has fallen behind on his rent following a poor harvest this season. My steward recommends the usual course, notice of eviction if the debt is not settled within the month." "And what do you recommend?" "I do not know," Julian admitted, the honesty of the confession seeming to surprise him as much as it did her. By strict accounting, the estate cannot afford to extend further leniency. We are already stretched thin enough as it is. But the man has worked this land faithfully for 15 years, through good seasons and bad, and I cannot bring myself to view his family's hardship as merely a line item to be resolved through eviction. Lorimer considered this for a moment, appreciating the genuine conflict visible in his expression, so different from the cold calculation that had characterized his original proposal to her. Might there be a middle path, perhaps extending the debt over a longer period, allowing him to catch up gradually rather than facing an impossible sum all at once? That is precisely what I have been considering, though it would require careful management of our own finances to accommodate the delay. Julian studied her with renewed interest. You have a talent for practical solutions, Miss Winslow. I begin to wonder if you might make rather a good steward yourself, should circumstances ever require it. I was raised in a merchant household, Your Grace. Practical solutions to financial difficulties were simply the language of my childhood, discussed openly at our dinner table rather than treated as some unmentionable indelicacy. She paused, then added, somewhat more hesitantly, my father has faced similar decisions himself, extending credit to struggling clients rather than calling in debts that would ruin them entirely. He always says that a debt collected too harshly benefits no one in the long run, for a ruined man cannot pay what he owes, while a man given room to recover often proves the most loyal customer a business ever gains. Your father sounds like a wise man. He is, though I do not always tell him so as often as I should. Lorimer smiled softly, thinking of Edmund Winslow's quiet strength, his careful balance of practicality and genuine compassion. Perhaps you might consider a similar approach with your tenant. Leniency now, in exchange for loyalty and continued labor in the years ahead, often proves the wiser investment than the short-term satisfaction of strict accounting. Julian nodded slowly, already reaching for a fresh sheet of paper to draft new instructions for his steward. I believe you are entirely correct, Miss Winslow. Thank you for the counsel. It was a small moment, unremarkable perhaps to any observer who might have glimpsed it in passing, and yet it represented something significant in the quiet evolution of their acquaintance. A genuine partnership of minds, a willingness on Julian's part to seek and value her perspective on matters far beyond the ordinary scope of courtship conversation, and a growing comfort on Lorimer's part in offering her opinions freely, trusting that they would be received with respect rather than dismissal. As the days of the house party continued, such moments accumulated steadily, small threads weaving together into something increasingly substantial. They discussed books during quiet afternoons in the library, discovering a shared fondness for novels that explored questions of character and morality rather than merely romantic intrigue. They walked together, more carefully now given Julian's healing ankle, through the estate's gardens, and Lorimer found herself sharing stories of her mother that she had not spoken aloud to anyone outside her own family in years. Julian, in turn, opened slowly about the pressures of his position, the loneliness of responsibilities inherited too young, the complicated relationship with his grandmother, who loved him fiercely but expressed that love primarily through demanding standards he often struggled to meet. She is not unkind, he explained one evening as they sat together near the fire in a quiet corner of the drawing room, the other guests occupied elsewhere with cards and conversation. She simply believes that duty and love are inseparable, that caring for someone means ensuring their success by whatever practical means necessary, even if that means arranging marriages like business transactions. I understand that kind of love, I think, Lorimer said thoughtfully. My father shows his affection through providing security, through building a fortune he hopes will protect me from the hardships he faced in his own youth. It is not always the kind of love that feels warm in the moment, but it comes from genuine care nonetheless. Do you think, Julian asked, his voice quieter now, more careful, that it is possible for practical beginnings to grow into something warmer, something chosen freely rather than simply arranged out of necessity? Lorimer met his gaze, aware of the weight beneath the question, aware that he was asking not merely about abstract philosophy, but about the two of them specifically, about whatever this careful, growing acquaintance between them might yet become. "I believe it is possible," she said slowly, "though I think it requires honesty at every step, a willingness to keep choosing genuine connection even after the practical necessity that first brought two people together has faded or resolved itself entirely. Otherwise, what remains is merely habit or obligation, rather than anything worth calling love." "Then I will endeavor to keep choosing it," Julian said quietly, "for as long as you allow me the privilege of trying." The moment held a quiet significance neither of them rushed to name explicitly, though something had shifted between them, a deepening of trust that neither the dramatic public proposal nor the practical courtship visits that followed had quite achieved. Lorimer found herself, for the first time since Charles Bennet's betrayal, allowing herself to imagine a future that included genuine partnership rather than merely careful self-protection. The house party concluded a few days later, the guests departing in a procession of carriages much as they had arrived, though the atmosphere surrounding their departure felt notably different from the curious, speculative energy that had greeted their arrival 2 weeks prior. Whispers still followed Lorimer and Julian, but their tone had shifted from skeptical curiosity to something closer to genuine interest, even in some cases, quiet approval. The Dowager Duchess herself bid Lorimer farewell with unexpected warmth, taking both her hands in a gesture far more personal than the cool formality of their first meeting weeks earlier. "You have surprised me, Miss Winslow," she said, her sharp eyes softened by something that might have been genuine affection. "I confess I approached this arrangement with considerable skepticism, viewing you primarily as a practical solution to circumstances rather than a person of genuine merit. I was wrong to view you so narrowly." "Thank you, Your Grace. That means a great deal coming from you. I hope, whatever comes of this courtship, that you understand my grandson has grown genuinely fond of you these past weeks, in ways that extend well beyond the practical circumstances that first brought you together. He has not laughed so freely in years as he has during this visit, nor sought counsel so readily from anyone beyond his closest advisors." The Duchess's expression grew momentarily vulnerable, revealing the depth of care beneath her formidable exterior. "He deserves genuine happiness, Miss Winslow, not merely practical convenience. I hope, whatever you decide, that you consider his heart alongside your own in whatever choice you ultimately make." Lorimer was moved by the unexpected sincerity of the Duchess's words, understanding for the first time the genuine love beneath the older woman's calculating exterior, a love expressed through practical arrangement, because that was the only language she had ever been taught for expressing such vulnerable feelings. "I will consider it carefully, Your Grace. I promise you that." As Lorimer's carriage pulled away from Lorimer Hall, carrying her back toward the ordinary rhythms of her life in the city, she found herself looking back at the grand stone house receding slowly into the distance, thinking not of its impressive architecture or storied history, but of quiet library conversations, of steady hands binding a wound, of a man who had begun to feel less like a duke and more, simply, like someone she genuinely wished to know better. Regardless of what title he carried, or what debt had first brought them together. Julian, watching her carriage depart from the front steps of his ancestral home, felt an unfamiliar ache settle in his chest, a longing for her continued presence that surprised him with its intensity. He had entered this courtship weeks earlier viewing it as a practical necessity, a duty to be fulfilled for the sake of his family's survival. He understood now, watching the carriage disappear around the curve of the drive, that it had become something else entirely, something he wanted for its own sake, independent of any debt or obligation. He did not yet know what the coming weeks would bring, whether Lorimer's growing trust would prove strong enough to survive whatever challenges still lay ahead, whether his own efforts to prove himself worthy of her genuine affection would ultimately succeed. But he knew, with a certainty that surprised him in its simplicity, that he no longer wished to marry Lorimer Winslow merely to settle a debt. He wished to marry her because he had, somewhere in the quiet accumulation of shared conversations and small vulnerable moments, fallen genuinely and completely in love with her. The question that remained, weighing on him as he turned back toward the house, was whether he could find the courage to tell her so honestly, and whether she would trust that confession enough to believe it, given how thoroughly her heart had been wounded once before by words that had ultimately proven hollow. The weeks following the house party settled into a new and gentler pattern between Julian and Alina, one built increasingly on genuine affection, rather than the careful, watchful courtship that had characterized their earlier meetings. Julian's visits to the Winslow townhouse grew more frequent, sometimes twice weekly, sometimes more, and the excuses for these visits grew thinner and less necessary as both of them stopped pretending that duty alone motivated the continued acquaintance. Autumn deepened into the crisp, golden days of late October, and Alina found herself, on one particularly fine afternoon, walking alongside Julian through the public gardens near the center of the city, their conversation flowing easily between topics both serious and light, as had become their comfortable habit. "I have been thinking," Julian said, his tone carrying a note of careful deliberation that Alina had learned to recognize as preceding something important, "about the debt that first brought us together." Alina's step slowed slightly, an old wariness stirring despite the genuine warmth that had grown between them over the preceding weeks. "What of it?" "My cousin, Henry Ashford, has offered to settle it entirely, from his own considerable fortune, gained through investments in the northern shipping trade that have proven remarkably successful this past year. He has offered this not as a loan, but as an outright gift, understanding the difficult position it has placed our family in, and wishing to see the matter resolved without further complication." Alina stopped walking entirely now, turning to face him with an expression caught between surprise and something more complicated. "The debt would be settled then, regardless of what happens between us." "Yes," Julian confirmed. "I wished you to know this immediately, because I do not want any shadow of doubt remaining about my intentions going forward. Whatever happens between us now, whatever choice you ultimately make regarding my continued courtship, will have nothing whatsoever to do with debts or financial obligation. I want you to know, with absolute certainty, that anything I say to you from this point forward comes from genuine feeling alone, entirely separate from any practical necessity." Alina searched his face carefully, looking for any trace of calculation, any hint that this revelation might itself be some new form of strategy. She found none, only earnest sincerity, and something in her chest loosened slightly, a knot of protective caution she had carried since Charles Bennet's betrayal beginning, finally, to unwind. "Why are you telling me this now, Julian?" He took a slow breath, and Alina noticed with some surprise that his hands trembled slightly, a rare display of vulnerability from a man usually so carefully composed. "Because I find that I can no longer continue courting you honestly while any doubt remains about my motivations. I proposed to you initially as a cowardly man, hiding behind duty and practical arrangement rather than admitting the far more frightening truth, that I wish to know you, genuinely, as a person worth knowing for her own sake. I was too afraid, then, to admit such vulnerable feelings, so I dressed them instead in the safer language of obligation and necessity. And now I no longer wish to hide behind such safety. Alina, I love you. Not the fortune your father built, not the convenient resolution to my family's debts, but you specifically, your sharp mind, your steady courage, your refusal to accept anything less than genuine regard from anyone who claims to care for you. I love the way you bind wounds without hesitation, the way you speak honestly even when honesty proves inconvenient, the way you have taught me, these past weeks, what it means to be valued for myself rather than merely my title." Alina's breath caught, the weight of his confession settling over her with an intensity she had not fully prepared herself for, despite the growing warmth of their recent weeks together. "Julian," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice the tangle of emotions rising within her. "You need not answer immediately," he said quickly, misreading her hesitation as reluctance rather than overwhelming emotion. I understand that trust, once broken, cannot simply be rebuilt through a single confession, however sincere. I only wished you to know the truth of my feelings, so that whatever you decide going forward, you decide it with complete honesty between us, rather than any lingering doubt about my intentions. Julian, Alina said again, more firmly this time, reaching out to still his nervous hands with her own steady grip. I am not hesitating out of doubt. I am hesitating because I am frightened, genuinely frightened, of how deeply I have already come to care for you, and how much that caring terrifies me given what I survived once before. She took a breath, steadying herself before continuing, aware that the moment demanded the same honesty he had just offered her. 3 years ago, I was engaged to a man named Charles Bennett. He spoke beautifully, wrote letters full of poetry, walked with me through gardens very much like these, speaking always of a shared future built on genuine love. I believed him entirely, Julian, with the whole of my young, trusting heart. And then an heiress with a larger dowry appeared, and he ended our engagement in a letter so brief and careless. It might have described the weather rather than the dissolution of everything I had believed we shared. Julian's expression darkened with genuine anger on her behalf, though he said nothing, allowing her to continue at her own pace. Since then, I have refused every advantageous match offered to me, not out of pride, but out of genuine terror that I might again mistake performance for sincerity, that I might again build my happiness on words that would prove hollow the moment a better prospect appeared. When you proposed to me that first evening with such cold, practical detachment, I recognized something in it that felt safer, in a strange way, than Charles's beautiful poetry ever had. At least your original coldness was honest about its transactional nature. I did not expect, nor did I particularly want, to find myself falling for the warmth that has grown between us since. Alina, Julian said softly, I am not Charles Bennett. I will not pretend to understand fully the depth of the wound he left you with, but I can promise you this. I have already demonstrated, through settling the debt without any expectation of return, that my regard for you has nothing to do with practical advantage. Whatever comes of this conversation, that debt remains settled. You owe me nothing, and I ask nothing of you beyond the possibility of your genuine trust, freely given rather than obligated by circumstance. Alina studied him for a long moment, the autumn light catching the earnest vulnerability in his expression, so different from the cold detachment of their first meeting weeks earlier. She thought of Margaret's gentle observations, of the Dowager Duchess's unexpected warmth, of the steady accumulation of small, genuine moments that had gradually worn away her careful defenses over the preceding weeks. I do not yet know if I can offer you complete trust, Julian, she said honestly. The wound Charles left runs deeper than a few weeks of pleasant courtship can fully heal. But I can tell you this. I have come, against every careful instinct I possess, to genuinely care for you as well. Not for your title, not for whatever security a marriage between us might provide, but for the man who follows me into gardens to apologize sincerely, who values my practical counsel on matters of estate management, who admitted his own fear and vulnerability rather than hiding behind performed confidence. A cautious hope kindled in Julian's expression, though he remained careful not to push too quickly against whatever fragile trust she was offering. Then perhaps that is enough, for now. Genuine care, honestly offered, even without complete trust. We can continue building from there, at whatever pace feels safe to you. I would like that, Alina said, a small, genuine smile breaking through her earlier hesitation. Though I ask one thing of you, Julian, going forward. Anything. If ever your feelings should change, if ever a better prospect or easier path should present itself, I ask that you tell me honestly and immediately, rather than allowing me to build false security on affections that have quietly faded. I survived Charles's betrayal once. I do not know that I could survive a second betrayal of that particular kind, especially not from someone I have allowed myself to trust as deeply as I am beginning to trust you. I promise you, Alina, with complete sincerity, that I will always choose honesty with you, regardless of how difficult that honesty might prove. You deserve nothing less, after everything you have survived. They continued their walk through the gardens as the afternoon light softened toward evening, their conversation lighter now, though the weight of what had passed between them lingered pleasantly in the comfortable silence that occasionally settled over their exchange. Lorimer felt something shifting within her, a cautious hope beginning to take root alongside her careful defenses, a growing belief that perhaps, against every expectation she had carried since Charles Bennet's betrayal, genuine love might yet prove possible for her after all. As Julian's carriage carried him home that evening, he found himself replaying every moment of their conversation, marveling at Lorimer's courage in sharing something so vulnerable, at her willingness to extend cautious trust despite every reason her past experience gave her to withhold it entirely. He understood more clearly than ever before the depth of what he was asking of her, and resolved, with quiet determination, to prove himself worthy of that trust through every action available to him, regardless of how long such proof might take to fully establish. The path ahead remained uncertain, complicated by the lingering shadow of Lorimer's past betrayal, and by whatever challenges society and circumstance might yet place before them. But for the first time since his father's death had burdened him with responsibilities far beyond his years, Julian felt genuine hope for a future built not on obligation or practical necessity, but on the far more precious and fragile foundation of freely chosen, genuinely reciprocated love. News of the settled debt spread through society far more quickly than either Julian or Lorimer might have wished, and with it came a fresh wave of speculation, some kind, much of it decidedly less so. Without the practical necessity of the debt binding them together, many in the county's social circles found themselves questioning anew why the Duke of Lorimer continued his courtship of a merchant's daughter, when surely, they reasoned, more advantageous matches now stood available to him. The Dowager Duchess Constance, despite her growing genuine fondness for Lorimer, found herself increasingly troubled by this shift in public perception, understanding better than most how quickly favorable opinion could curdle into damaging gossip when left unchecked. "You must be careful, Julian," she warned him one evening, several weeks after the debt settlement had become common knowledge. "Without the debt to explain your continued interest, tongues have begun wagging in less charitable directions. Some now suggest Miss Winslow has employed some manner of manipulation to secure your continued attention, playing at reluctance and virtue while quietly scheming toward the same advantageous marriage any ambitious young woman might desire." Julian's expression darkened with genuine anger at the suggestion. "That is absurd, and cruel besides. Lorimer has shown nothing but genuine caution throughout our entire acquaintance, refusing to trust easily precisely because she has been wounded before by false promises. To suggest she now schemes toward manipulation is a grotesque misreading of her character." "I do not say I believe it, Julian, only that others do, and such beliefs, however unfounded, can cause considerable damage if left unaddressed. Society requires narratives it can understand, and settling a debt through marriage provides a far more comprehensible story than two people who have genuinely grown to love one another despite an inauspicious beginning." The rumors, as the Duchess had feared, grew more pointed in the weeks that followed. Whispers reached Lorimer through Margaret, who reported them with evident distress, describing increasingly elaborate tales suggesting that Lorimer had orchestrated the public refusal at the original ball as a calculated strategy, designed to make herself appear virtuous and desirable precisely by seeming to reject easy advantage, thereby securing a far deeper commitment from the Duke than a simple acceptance might have achieved. "It is monstrous," Margaret said, her usual cheerful energy replaced by genuine indignation as she relayed the latest version of the gossip to Lorimer over tea. "They are suggesting you are some manner of skilled manipulator, playing the long game of feminine strategy to secure a duke's genuine devotion rather than merely his practical obligation. As though your refusal that night was calculated theater rather than genuine, principled conviction." Lorimer felt the familiar ache of old wounds reopening, the same helpless frustration she had experienced years earlier when Charles Bennet's betrayal had left her the subject of considerable gossip, much of it suggesting she had somehow failed to hold his interest, rather than acknowledging that he had simply chosen a more advantageous prospect. The particular cruelty of such rumors, she reflected bitterly, lay in how thoroughly they stripped women of agency, casting them either as helpless victims of circumstance or as calculating manipulators, with little room allowed for the simple, complicated truth of genuine human feeling. "What does Julian say of these rumors?" Margaret asked gently, watching her friend's expression carefully. "I have not yet told him the full extent of what is being said," Alina admitted. "I did not wish to burden him further, given how carefully he has already worked to prove his sincerity these past weeks. Alina, if this courtship is to survive, and I believe with my whole heart that it should, you must trust him enough to share your burdens honestly, just as he has shared his with you. That is, after all, precisely what you asked of him." Alina recognized the wisdom in her friend's counsel, however uncomfortable it proved to acknowledge, and resolved to speak honestly with Julian at their next meeting, regardless of how difficult such vulnerability might prove. She did not need to wait long for that opportunity. Julian called the following afternoon, and something in his careful, measured expression suggested he had already learned, through his own channels, the full extent of the damaging rumors circulating through society. "You have heard, then," Alina said, watching his face for confirmation. "I have heard," Julian confirmed grimly, "and I intend to address it directly, publicly, at the Ashford Ball this coming Saturday, where I understand a considerable portion of society's most influential voices will be gathered. Julian, I do not wish you to feel obligated to defend my reputation at the cost of your own standing. These rumors will fade in time, as gossip always eventually does. They will fade far more quickly, and far more completely, if addressed directly rather than left to fester unchecked." His jaw set with quiet determination, an expression Alina had come to recognize as signaling genuine resolve rather than mere obstinance. "I will not stand silently while you are cast as either helpless victim or calculating manipulator, when the true story is neither of those things, but simply two people who found their way to genuine love through an admittedly unconventional beginning. You deserve to have that truth spoken plainly, and I intend to speak it myself, publicly, regardless of whatever social cost that honesty might carry for my own standing." Alina felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, moved by the depth of his commitment, so entirely different from Charles Bennet's cowardly retreat into a brief, careless letter when circumstances had grown inconvenient for him. "Julian, you need not risk your reputation on my account." "I am not risking my reputation on your account, Alina. I am protecting our shared future together from the corrosive effect of lies left unaddressed. There is a considerable difference, and I would ask you to trust that distinction, even if the coming days prove difficult for us both." The Ashford Ball arrived with all the anticipation and anxiety such an event naturally carried, heightened further by the awareness among many attendees that some manner of confrontation seemed likely, given the intensity of recent gossip. Alina arrived wearing a gown of deep green silk, chosen deliberately for its understated elegance rather than any attempt at ostentatious display. Her chin held high despite the nervous flutter in her stomach as she entered the crowded ballroom. Julian found her within minutes of her arrival, his expression carrying the same quiet resolve she had witnessed during their earlier conversation. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly, offering his arm. "I am uncertain what 'ready' means for a moment such as this," Alina admitted honestly. "But I trust you, Julian, whatever you intend to say." They moved together through the crowded ballroom until they reached a slightly elevated area near the musicians, where Julian, with the natural authority of his position, signaled for the orchestra to pause and requested a brief moment of everyone's attention. The room quieted gradually, curious murmurs rippling through the assembled guests as they turned their attention toward the Duke and his companion. "I understand," Julian began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed ballroom, "that considerable speculation has circulated recently regarding my courtship of Miss Alina Winslow, speculation that has grown increasingly unkind, and I must say plainly, entirely inaccurate. He paused, letting his gaze move deliberately across the assembled crowd before continuing. Some have suggested that Miss Winslow's initial refusal of my proposal, months ago, represented calculated strategy rather than genuine principle. I can assure you with complete certainty that this is false. Miss Winslow refused me that evening because I proposed to her as though completing a business transaction rather than genuinely seeking her hand. And she possessed the courage and self-respect to name that failing plainly in front of all of you, regardless of the social cost such honesty carried for herself. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some approving, others still skeptical, but Julian continued regardless, his voice growing steadier as he pressed on. Since that evening, I have come to know Miss Winslow genuinely, and I have found in her not calculation, but consistent, principled honesty. She has counseled me wisely on matters of estate management. She bound my wounds without hesitation when I injured myself during a walk at Lorimer Hall. She has shared with me the painful truth of a previous betrayal that taught her, quite reasonably, to guard her heart carefully against false promises. And despite that painful history, she has extended toward me a trust I have worked, and continue to work, every day to prove myself worthy of receiving. He turned now to face Lorimer directly, his expression softening from public determination into something far more personal and tender. The debt that first prompted my initial, clumsy proposal has been entirely settled, through my cousin's generous gift, with no expectation of anything further from Miss Winslow or her family. Whatever continues between us now exists entirely because I have come to love her, genuinely and completely, for herself alone, and because she has, despite every reason her past experience gave her for caution, allowed herself to consider caring for me in return. The ballroom fell into stunned silence, the weight of his public declaration settling over the assembled guests, with an intensity that left even the most enthusiastic gossips momentarily speechless. I say this publicly, Julian continued, not merely to defend Miss Winslow's reputation from unfounded rumor, though that reputation certainly deserves defending. I say it because I believe genuine love, however unconventional its beginning, deserves to be spoken honestly rather than hidden behind whispered speculation. Miss Winslow taught me that lesson herself, the very first evening we properly spoke, when she had the courage to name an uncomfortable truth in front of all of you, regardless of the cost. He turned back to Lorimer, taking her hand gently in his own. I do not know yet whether Miss Winslow will ultimately choose to accept my continued courtship, nor do I believe that decision is any of society's business beyond what we ourselves choose to share. But I wished all of you to understand, clearly and without ambiguity, that whatever passes between us proceeds from genuine mutual regard, freely chosen by two people who have found, against considerable odds, something worth genuinely valuing in one another. The silence held for a long moment before scattered applause began, growing gradually into something more general and enthusiastic. The assembled guests moved despite themselves by the evident sincerity of the Duke's public declaration. Lorimer felt tears finally spill freely down her cheeks, unable to contain the overwhelming emotion of witnessing Julian choose her honor over his own comfortable reputation, so completely opposite from Charles Bennet's cowardly retreat when circumstances had grown similarly difficult. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the continuing applause and rising murmur of conversation. "I do not think anyone has ever defended me so completely, nor so publicly." "You deserve nothing less," Julian said softly, his own eyes suspiciously bright with emotion. "You have taught me these past months what genuine courage looks like. I could do no less than match that courage with my own, however uncomfortable the public setting." As the orchestra resumed playing, and the ballroom gradually returned to its ordinary rhythms of conversation and dance, Lorimer found herself surrounded by a markedly different atmosphere than the skeptical curiosity that had greeted her arrival earlier that evening. Several of the county's most prominent ladies approached her directly, offering warm congratulations and expressions of admiration for the evident strength of character Julian's speech had revealed in her. The Dowager Duchess, watching from a nearby alcove, allowed herself a rare, genuine smile, understanding that her grandson had finally found something more valuable than any practical arrangement she might have engineered on his behalf. A partnership built on genuine mutual respect and freely chosen love, strong enough to weather public scrutiny and emerge, if anything, more firmly established than before. The rumors did not vanish entirely, for gossip rarely disappears completely regardless of how thoroughly it is addressed. But their power diminished considerably in the weeks that followed, replaced gradually by a new narrative, one that spoke admiringly of the Duke's public devotion and Aliner's evident strength of character, rather than the earlier suggestions of calculation or manipulation. For Aliner, watching Julian navigate the remainder of the evening with his usual quiet composure now visibly softened by genuine happiness, the events of the Ashford ball represented something far more significant than mere reputation management. They represented proof, tangible and public, that Julian's regard for her ran deeper than convenient words spoken in private gardens. He had chosen her honor over his own comfort, publicly and without hesitation, exactly the opposite of what Charles Bennet had done when circumstances had grown similarly inconvenient years earlier. For the first time since that painful betrayal, Aliner allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that perhaps genuine love, freely given and consistently proven through action rather than mere words, might indeed be possible for her after all. Winter arrived early that year, dusting the countryside with frost long before the first snows typically appeared, and with its arrival came a quieter season for Julian and Aliner's courtship, one marked less by dramatic public moments, and more by the steady accumulation of everyday trust that neither of them had fully anticipated when their acquaintance began so awkwardly months earlier. Julian's visits continued regularly through the colder months, though now they carried an ease that had been entirely absent during those first careful weeks of courtship. He no longer arrived bearing careful gifts calculated to impress, nor did he speak with the measured formality that had characterized his earlier attempts at conversation. Instead, he simply came, often finding Aliner in the modest parlor of her father's townhouse, sometimes reading, sometimes working through correspondence of her own, and settled comfortably into whatever activity occupied her afternoon, content simply to share her company without requiring elaborate entertainment or performance from either of them. Edmund Winslow, watching this quiet development from the periphery of his daughter's life, found himself gradually reassured that his earlier concerns about the match had been misplaced. He had worried, initially, that any marriage to a duke would inevitably prove hollow, built more on the exchange of practical advantage than genuine affection. Instead, he observed something considerably more substantial developing between his daughter and the young duke, a partnership grounded in mutual respect that reminded him, with a bittersweet ache, of his own marriage to Aliner's late mother. "You seem happy," he observed one evening, finding Aliner in the parlor after Julian's departure, her expression carrying a soft contentment that had been noticeably absent during the difficult years following Charles Bennet's betrayal. "I believe I am happy, father," Aliner admitted, setting aside the book she had been only partially reading, her attention having drifted repeatedly toward memories of the afternoon's quiet conversation with Julian. "Though I confess it still surprises me how thoroughly my feelings have shifted these past months, given how carefully I guarded against exactly this kind of vulnerability. Your mother would be proud of you, Aliner, for choosing carefully rather than settling for convenient security or empty performance. She always said that genuine love reveals itself not through grand declarations alone, but through the accumulation of small, consistent choices, made day after day, that demonstrate a person's true character over time." "I think I finally understand what she meant by that," Aliner said softly, thinking of Julian's steady presence throughout the preceding months, of his willingness to defend her publicly at real cost to his own comfort, of the countless smaller moments that had gradually rebuilt her capacity for trust after Charles's betrayal had so thoroughly shattered it. As winter deepened, Julian found himself increasingly preoccupied with a question he had been quietly considering since the night of the Ashford ball, when his public declaration had revealed, unmistakably, the depth of his genuine feelings for Lorimer. He wished to propose again, properly this time, without any lingering shadow of debt or obligation clouding the sincerity of his intentions. But he understood, with a carefulness born from watching Lorimer's slow, hard-won recovery of trust, that timing mattered enormously, that rushing toward another proposal too quickly might undermine the very foundation of patient, consistent honesty they had worked so carefully to establish between them. He sought counsel, somewhat reluctantly, from his grandmother, whose sharp practical wisdom had proven surprisingly valuable throughout the preceding months, despite her initial skepticism about the match's unconventional beginning. "You wish to propose again," the Dowager Duchess observed, not particularly surprised by her grandson's hesitant admission during one of their regular evening conversations. "I confess I wondered when you would finally work up sufficient courage to raise the matter properly." "I do not wish to rush her, grandmother. Lorimer has trusted me with a great deal these past months, but I understand that trust remains fragile, given everything she survived before we met. I do not wish to risk that fragile trust through impatience. There is a difference, Julian, between rushing and simply proceeding with confidence once genuine trust has been established. You have spent months proving your sincerity through consistent action rather than mere words. I do not believe Lorimer requires further proof at this point, only the opportunity to formally acknowledge what has already grown quietly between you." The Duchess's expression softened unexpectedly, a rare display of genuine warmth breaking through her usually formidable composure. "I have watched you these past months, Julian, and I confess I have rarely seen you so genuinely happy, nor so thoroughly yourself, unburdened by the constant performance your position typically demands. Whatever fears drive your hesitation now, I do not believe they serve either you or Lorimer particularly well." Julian considered his grandmother's counsel carefully over the following days, turning the question over repeatedly in his mind. As the first snows of the season began falling steadily across the Lorimer estate, transforming the familiar grounds into something quieter and more contemplative than their usual autumn colors had allowed, he found himself returning, again and again, to the memory of that garden fountain where their acquaintance had properly begun months earlier, back when Lorimer's rejection had first taught him the difference between practical arrangement and genuine connection. He resolved, finally, that he would propose again in that very spot, once the winter fully settled and circumstances allowed for a private, unhurried moment together, away from the watchful eyes of society that had complicated so much of their courtship's public dimensions. He wished, this time, for the proposal to belong entirely to the two of them, unwitnessed by anyone beyond the quiet winter landscape itself. Lorimer, unaware of Julian's careful planning, continued through the winter weeks with a growing sense of settled contentment, though occasional flickers of her old caution still surfaced periodically, particularly during quiet moments alone when memories of Charles Bennet's betrayal resurfaced unbidden. She found herself, during these moments, deliberately recalling instead the accumulated evidence of Julian's genuine character: his public defense at the Ashford ball, his consistent presence throughout the preceding months, his willingness to seek her counsel on estate matters rather than dismissing her opinions as irrelevant to a man of his position. Margaret, ever perceptive about her friend's emotional state, noticed these lingering flickers of doubt during one of their regular visits shortly before the Christmas season began in earnest. "You still worry sometimes that this happiness might prove temporary," Margaret observed, watching Lorimer's expression carefully as they sat together over tea in the Winslow parlor. "I do," Lorimer admitted honestly. "Not because I doubt Julian's sincerity, particularly not after everything he has done these past months to prove it, but because I know, from painful experience, how quickly circumstances can shift, how easily even genuine feelings can fade when tested by real difficulty, rather than the relatively easy pleasantness we have shared so far." "Perhaps," Margaret said thoughtfully, The true test of love is not whether doubt ever surfaces, but whether we choose to act with trust and openness despite that doubt, rather than allowing fear to close us off entirely from genuine connection. You cannot control whether Julian's feelings might someday change, Lorimer, any more than you could have controlled Charles's ultimate betrayal. But you can control whether you allow fear of that possibility to prevent you from fully embracing the genuine happiness available to you now. Lorimer considered her friend's words carefully, recognizing the wisdom within them even as she acknowledged how difficult such wisdom proved to fully embody in practice. You are right, Margaret, as you so often are. I think I have been waiting, perhaps unconsciously, for some final proof that would eliminate all doubt entirely, some guarantee that this happiness will last indefinitely. But I begin to understand that no such guarantee exists, for anyone, regardless of how genuine their partner's feelings might be. Love, it seems, always requires a measure of courage, a willingness to remain vulnerable despite the very real possibility of future hurt. And do you believe, despite that inherent risk, that Julian is worth such courage? Lorimer did not hesitate in her answer, the certainty of it surprising even herself with its clarity. I do, Margaret. I believe, more certainly than I have believed anything in years, that Julian Ashcombe is entirely worth whatever courage this continued trust requires of me. As December progressed toward its close, bringing with it the particular quiet beauty of a countryside blanketed in fresh snow, Julian finally judged the moment right for his carefully planned proposal. He arranged, through a quiet conversation with Edmund Winslow that secured the merchant's blessing without revealing the specific timing of his intentions, for Lorimer to visit Lorimer Hall once more, ostensibly to assist with preparations for the estate's traditional Christmas celebrations, an invitation Lorimer accepted with genuine enthusiasm, unaware of the deeper significance Julian had planned for her visit. Lorimer arrived at Lorimer Hall 3 days before Christmas, the estate transformed by winter into something quietly magical, its familiar stone walls softened by drifts of fresh snow, evergreen boughs draped along the entrance hall in preparation for the coming celebrations, the scent of cinnamon and roasting chestnuts drifting pleasantly from the kitchens below. The Dowager Duchess greeted her with the same warmth that had characterized their relationship since the house party months earlier, drawing Lorimer into a brief, genuine embrace that would have seemed entirely impossible during their first, cooler meeting. "I am glad you have come, my dear," the Duchess said, her sharp eyes carrying an unmistakable twinkle of anticipation that Lorimer, distracted by the general excitement of the season, did not immediately recognize as significant. "Julian has been rather restless these past few days, awaiting your arrival with more impatience than I have witnessed from him in years." "I hope I have not kept him waiting overly long," Lorimer said, laughing softly at the image of the usually composed Duke pacing impatiently through his own halls. "Not at all, my dear. Some things are simply worth the wait, however long that wait might feel to the person anticipating them." Lorimer found Julian shortly afterward, occupied in the estate's grand hall directing the placement of a substantial Christmas tree, its branches still bare of decoration, but already filling the space with the fresh, resinous scent of pine. He looked up at her arrival, and something in his expression, a particular blend of nervousness and genuine joy, caught her attention immediately. "Lorimer," he said, crossing the hall to greet her properly, taking both her hands in his own with evident warmth. "I am so glad you have come. Your grandmother mentioned you have been rather impatient for my arrival," Lorimer said, watching his expression carefully, curious about the particular energy she sensed radiating from him. "I confess I have been," Julian admitted, a faint flush coloring his cheeks despite his usual composure. "Though I hope you will forgive my impatience once you understand its cause." Over the following 2 days, the estate buzzed with preparation for the coming Christmas celebrations, and Lorimer found herself thoroughly enjoying the festive activity, assisting with decoration alongside Julian and the household staff, sampling early attempts at the traditional Christmas pudding, and generally settling into the comfortable rhythms of a household she had come to genuinely love, quite apart from her feelings for its master. On the third evening of her visit, as the last light of the winter afternoon faded toward the particular blue darkness of a snowy dusk, Julian found her in the estate's library, curled comfortably in a chair near the fire with a book she had selected from his considerable collection. "Would you walk with me?" he asked, something in his careful tone catching her attention immediately, reminiscent of the particular deliberation he had shown before their earlier significant conversations. "Now, it is nearly dark, Julian, and quite cold outside." "I know, I would ask it nonetheless if you are willing. There is somewhere I wish to show you, and I believe the timing matters rather considerably." Curious despite the evening's chill, Lorimer set aside her book and allowed Julian to help her into a warm cloak before they made their way outside together, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid evening air. He led her, without particular explanation, along the familiar path toward the garden where their acquaintance had properly begun months earlier, the same fountain where Lorimer had first spoken her memorable rejection on that transformative evening. The garden looked entirely different now, transformed by winter into something quiet and ethereal, the fountain's water stilled by cold, its stone surfaces dusted with fresh snow that caught and reflected the emerging starlight overhead. Julian had arranged, Lorimer noticed with growing wonder, for small lanterns to be placed carefully around the fountain's perimeter, their warm golden light creating an intimate circle of illumination against the surrounding darkness. "Julian," she breathed, taking in the careful beauty of the scene, "what is all this?" He turned to face her fully, and Lorimer noticed his hands trembling slightly, an echo of the vulnerability he had shown during his earlier confession weeks before, though something steadier and more certain now underlay that nervousness. "Do you remember," he said quietly, "what happened in this very spot all those months ago?" "I remember," Lorimer said softly. "You followed me here after I refused your proposal so publicly and asked only for the chance to understand me better." "I have thought of that moment often these past months," Julian continued, reaching to take her hands gently in his own. "At the time, I did not fully understand why your words struck me so deeply, why I accept your rejection lodged itself in my mind rather than simply offending my pride as it perhaps should have. I understand now that it was because, for the first time in longer than I could remember, someone had spoken to me with complete, unguarded honesty, refusing to perform gratitude or acceptance simply because propriety demanded it." He knelt then, carefully in the snow, and Lorimer felt her breath catch entirely, understanding immediately what was about to unfold. "Lorimer Winslow, I am not proposing to you tonight because of any debt, any obligation, any practical arrangement between our families. That debt has long since been settled, entirely separate from whatever passes between us now. I am asking you instead, because I have come to love you more completely than I believed myself capable of loving anyone. I love your fierce honesty, your practical wisdom, your steady courage in the face of circumstances that would have broken someone with less strength of character. I love how you have taught me, through your example, what it means to value someone for themselves rather than for what they might provide." He paused, drawing a small ring from his coat pocket, its simple, elegant design catching the lantern light with a soft, warm glow. "I am not asking you to accept a duke, nor a title, nor security, nor any of the practical advantages our first, clumsy encounter might have suggested were the true substance of my interest. I am asking you, simply and entirely, to accept me, Julian, the man who has learned from you what genuine love actually requires: patience, honesty, and the courage to remain vulnerable even when circumstances make such vulnerability frightening." Tears had begun falling freely down Lorimer's cheeks, warm against the cold winter air, as she absorbed the full weight of his careful, genuine words, so entirely different from the cold, transactional proposal that had begun their acquaintance months earlier. "Lorimer Winslow," Julian finished, his voice steady now despite the emotion evident in his expression, "will you marry me?" Lorimer knelt down beside him in the snow, uncaring of propriety or the cold seeping through her skirts, taking his face gently in her hands as she looked into his eyes with complete, unguarded certainty. "Julian," she said, her voice carrying the same clear conviction that had marked her memorable rejection months earlier in that very spot. "I accept." She paused, a small, genuine smile breaking through her tears, echoing deliberately the words that had begun their entire complicated, beautiful journey together. "And this time, Your Grace, I mean every word." Julian's answering smile transformed his entire expression, joy breaking free of every careful restraint he had maintained throughout their months of patient courtship, and he gathered her into an embrace that spoke more eloquently than any further words might have managed, the two of them kneeling together in the softly falling snow, surrounded by warm lantern light, in the very garden where their unlikely love story had first, unexpectedly, begun. "I love you," Julian murmured against her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "Completely, genuinely, entirely for yourself alone." "I love you too," Lorimer answered, the words feeling both new and inevitable, the natural conclusion of everything they had built together through months of patient honesty and gradually rebuilt trust. "I did not believe, after Charles, that I would ever again trust anyone enough to say those words genuinely. You have taught me otherwise, Julian, through every consistent, honest action these past months." They remained there together for a long while, kneeling beside the frozen fountain in the gently falling snow, the lantern light casting warm shadows across their joined figures, utterly unconcerned with the cold or with propriety or with anything beyond the profound joy of finally, genuinely, completely belonging to one another. When they finally returned to the house, hand in hand and both slightly damp from the snow, they found the Dowager Duchess waiting near the entrance, her sharp eyes taking in their joined hands and evident happiness with an expression of genuine, unrestrained delight rarely witnessed from the formidable older woman. "Well," she said, drawing Lorimer into another warm embrace, "I believe congratulations are finally in order." "They are, grandmother," Julian confirmed, his arm settling comfortably around Lorimer's shoulders. "Lorimer has agreed to marry me, properly this time, for reasons that have nothing whatsoever to do with debts or convenient arrangement." "I confess I am rather relieved to hear it," the Duchess said, though her teasing tone could not entirely disguise the genuine emotion evident in her expression. "I have grown rather fond of you these past months, Lorimer, and would have been considerably disappointed had my grandson failed to secure your genuine affection after everything I witnessed developing between you." The Christmas celebrations that followed carried a particular joy, the entire household seeming to sense and share in the couple's evident happiness, and news of the engagement spread quickly through society in the days that followed, this time carrying none of the earlier skepticism or damaging speculation that had troubled their courtship's middle months. Instead, the story that circulated now spoke admiringly of genuine love triumphing over an unpromising beginning, of a duke and a merchant's daughter who had found, through patient honesty and consistent proof of character, something considerably more valuable than any practically arranged marriage might have achieved. Edmund Winslow, upon receiving the news of his daughter's engagement, embraced her with tears openly visible in his weathered eyes. "Your mother would be so very proud of you, Lorimer," he said softly. "You have found exactly the kind of love she always hoped you might discover, chosen freely and proven consistently through genuine action rather than empty words." As winter gave way gradually to the first signs of spring, Julian and Lorimer's wedding preparations began in earnest, the ceremony planned for the following summer, when the Lorimer estate's extensive gardens would be in full, glorious bloom. Lorimer found herself, during the months of preparation, reflecting often on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point, from that dramatic, defiant rejection in a crowded ballroom to this quiet, certain joy of genuine partnership freely chosen. She understood now, with a clarity that continued to deepen as their wedding day approached, that her initial rejection had never truly been a rejection at all, not of Julian himself, but of the cold, transactional understanding of marriage he had initially presented to her. In refusing that hollow proposal so publicly, she had, without fully realizing it at the time, opened space for something considerably more genuine to grow between them, a partnership built patiently on mutual respect, honest vulnerability, and freely chosen love rather than mere practical necessity. The words she had spoken that fateful evening, "I accept your rejection, your grace," had seemed, at the time, like a definitive ending to whatever possibility existed between them. Instead, they had become, quite unexpectedly, the true beginning of everything that followed, the honest foundation upon which two people, initially strangers bound only by circumstance, had gradually, carefully, and genuinely fallen in love. The wedding took place on a warm June morning, exactly as Alina had once imagined it during quiet daydreams she had scarcely allowed herself to indulge in the years following Charles Bennet's betrayal. The gardens of Lorimer Hall, precisely as Julian had promised, bloomed magnificently for the occasion, roses and lavender filling the air with sweet fragrance as guests gathered beneath a canopy of early summer sunshine to witness the joining of two people whose story had, by that point, become something of a legend throughout the county, told and retold as an example of genuine love triumphing over an unpromising, transactional beginning. Margaret served as Alina's attendant, beaming with unrestrained joy as she helped arrange the final details of her friend's gown, a simple, elegant creation of ivory silk that suited Alina's practical sensibilities far better than anything more elaborate might have achieved. Edmund Winslow walked his daughter down the garden aisle with tears openly streaming down his weathered face, pride and joy mingling visibly in his expression, as he prepared to give her hand to a man he had, over the preceding months, come to genuinely respect and trust. The Dowager Duchess Constance, seated in the front row alongside the other assembled guests, watched the ceremony unfold with an expression of profound satisfaction, understanding better than most present the remarkable journey that had brought these two people together, from cold arrangement to genuine, hard-won love. Julian, waiting at the end of the garden aisle beneath a simple arch decorated with white roses, felt his breath catch entirely as Alina came into view, radiant in her simple gown, her expression carrying the same steady confidence that had first captured his attention months earlier, that evening, when she had refused his cold proposal with such unwavering conviction. The ceremony itself proceeded with quiet elegance, the efficient speaking of love built on genuine partnership rather than mere convenient arrangement, and when the moment finally arrived for the couple to exchange their vows, Julian found himself departing slightly from the traditional words, unable to resist adding a small, personal addition that drew soft, knowing laughter from those guests who understood its particular significance. "I promise," he said, looking directly into Alina's eyes with complete sincerity, "to never again offer you anything less than my genuine, complete self, exactly as you taught me to offer, that first evening in this very garden months ago." Alina's answering smile carried both amusement and profound emotion, as she offered her own vows in return, concluding with words that echoed deliberately back to the beginning of their unlikely story. "And I promise, Julian, to always accept exactly what you offer honestly, exactly as I meant every word I have ever spoken to you, beginning with that very first, unexpected rejection." The gathered guests, many of whom had witnessed or heard detailed accounts of that original dramatic ballroom scene, laughed warmly at the callback, understanding fully the journey these particular words represented, from cold arrangement through patient courtship to this moment of genuine, joyful commitment. As the ceremony concluded, and the newly married Duke and Duchess of Lorimer turned to face their assembled guests, sunlight breaking through the garden canopy to illuminate their joined hands, Alina felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, entirely different from the careful guardedness that had characterized so much of her life since Charles Bennet's betrayal years earlier. She understood now, standing beside Julian in the very garden where their story had properly begun, that genuine love required exactly what she had always instinctively known, but had needed months of patient proof to fully trust again. Honesty consistently offered, vulnerability freely chosen despite genuine risk, and the courage to keep choosing one another, day after day, regardless of whatever practical circumstances might once have brought two people together in the first place. The wedding celebration continued long into the warm summer evening, music and laughter filling the Lorimer estate's grand halls as guests danced and celebrated the union of two people whose unlikely love story had captured the imagination of the entire county. Julian and Alina moved through their own celebration with quiet joy, pausing occasionally to exchange glances that spoke more eloquently than any conversation might have managed, each glance carrying the accumulated weight of everything they had built together over the preceding months. In the years that followed, their marriage continued to grow and deepen, weathering the ordinary challenges any genuine partnership inevitably encounters, but doing so with the same foundation of honest communication and mutual respect that had characterized their courtship from its transformative beginning in that garden. Julian, guided consistently by Alina's practical wisdom, gradually restored the Lorimer estate to genuine financial security, not through cold calculation alone, but through the same balanced compassion Alina had counseled during their early conversations about the struggling tenant farmer, extending fairness and patience alongside necessary practicality. Alina, in turn, found in her marriage exactly what she had once believed impossible to trust again: genuine partnership with a man who valued her mind and character as thoroughly as any other quality she brought to their union, who continued, even years into their marriage, to seek her counsel and honor her perspective as an equal partner in every decision that shaped their shared life together. The Dowager Duchess, in her later years, often told the story of their courtship to visiting guests, particularly to young couples navigating their own uncertain beginnings, always concluding with the same gentle observation that had, by then, become something of a family motto, repeated with genuine conviction whenever the story was shared. "Love," she would say, her sharp eyes softened by the particular wisdom that comes from witnessing genuine happiness unfold before her, rarely announces itself through grand declarations alone. More often, it reveals itself through the accumulation of small, consistent choices, through honesty offered even when convenient lies might prove easier, through the courage to remain vulnerable despite every reasonable fear that vulnerability might not be safely returned. My grandson and his wife discovered exactly this truth, beginning with a rejection that seemed, at the time, like a definitive ending, but which proved instead to be the honest foundation of everything genuine that followed. And indeed, whenever Alina and Julian were asked in later years to share the story of how their unlikely love had begun, they would exchange the same knowing smile, understanding completely the profound truth embedded in their unconventional beginning: that sometimes the most honest rejection offered in good conscience proves far more valuable, in the end, than any easy acceptance offered without genuine conviction. "I accept your rejection, Your Grace," Alina had said, that first dramatic evening, never imagining how thoroughly those words would come to define the honest, patient, genuinely chosen love that would eventually grow between two people who had begun as virtual strangers bound only by circumstance and debt. Julian had been entirely unaware, that evening, standing humiliated in his own crowded ballroom, that she had meant every single word. He understood now, years into their genuine, deeply happy marriage, that her meaning every word had been precisely the gift he needed most, the honest foundation upon which everything genuine and lasting between them had eventually, patiently, and beautifully been built.